Hello, welcome to Phantom Homicide, decoding deception in Homicide 911 calls, the emergency call. It's arguably the most terrifying, unscripted moment a person ever shares with law enforcement. It is just the immediate, raw, verbal statement made right in the face of death, captured instantly and forever. Our deep dive today is really a forensic journey. We're looking into what happens when that raw statement is deliberately twisted, manipulated, or, used as a calculated performance to hide something truly horrifying.
Exactly. And our mission here is to take a really hard look at this intersection of, well, notorious true crime history, our fascination with it in pop culture, and the hard linguistic science behind it all. We're focusing on that purest form of communication to the police, that very first unguarded verbal response. And the big question is, can it really be faked convincingly when the stakes are literally life or death? We're going to show you that actually science says there are definite tells, unmistakable ones.
And the trigger for this whole exploration, the thing that kind of drags this dark past right into the present, is the recent return of the TV show 911. Its 8th season kicks off with this really chilling plot hook. It centers on a disturbing 911 call that Maddie handles, and it's explicitly inspired by a real horrific case, the infamous 1980 Weepy-Voiced killer.
Yeah, and that fictional storyline, it reflects a very real, almost existential challenge for investigators, especially for the dispatchers. Talking to potentially a killer in real time, how do you, under all that intense pressure, figure out what's genuine, overwhelming distress versus a meticulously crafted, manipulative performance? So we're unpacking the true history of the killer who actually gave himself that horrifying moniker, Paul Michael Stephani. And then we'll dig into the precise forensic science that's been developed specifically to unmask that kind of deception, turning subjective emotion into objective evidence.
Okay, let's start there. With the man whose manipulation is now, fodder for popular television drama, Paul Michael Stephani, born in Austin, Minnesota back in 1944. His background, while like so many violent offenders, it seems to feature those unsettling early markers. He came from a large family, I think the second of 10 kids, and they were devoutly Catholic, but it sounds like the stability was paper thin.
Oh, is far from stable. And this context is really crucial, I think. His stepfather was apparently prone to rage and occasional physical abuse. The source material we looked at notes he would sometimes hit the children or even, get this, throw them down the stairs if they angered him or just got in his way.
Threw them down the stairs? Wow.
Yeah. And that kind of severe formative trauma, it's often linked, as you might expect, to the adult behaviors we see later. Things like intensely controlling or needy interpersonal patterns, difficulty forming real emotional attachments, maybe a tendency toward violent dissociation. It really sets the stage for kind of broken moral compass.
And Stephanie's adult life just became a perfect storm, really, an example of this spiral. He moved to the Twin Cities, Minneapolis-St. Paul area. He married Beverly Laida, had a daughter, but apparently he struggled immensely with the Catholic stigma when the divorce was finalized in 1975. He saw his life, and maybe his identity, just unraveling. Then, two major losses seemed to accelerate his descent. He gets fired from his job as a janitor at the Malmberg Manufacturing Company in 1977.
Right. And his new girlfriend, someone he was apparently very attached to, she returned to Syria for an arranged marriage. He felt completely betrayed by that.
So the job and the relationship gone.
Exactly. It's those accumulated losses, family, job, love, stability, that seemed to trigger a total break. He cut ties with Beverly, his ex-wife, and completely abandoned his daughter, just walked away. And the rage, well, it had nowhere to go but outward. And tellingly, that Malmberg Manufacturing Company, the site where he experienced that loss of his job, his stability, that would become the location of his first major attack.
Chilling. So this really sets the stage for what became this terrifying and frankly unpredictable reign of terror across the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. Lasted from late 1980 through 82. And the lack of a clear profile for the killer, plus the bizarre nature of his communication, it must have absolutely terrorized the community.
Oh, undoubtedly.
Sure.
And the crimes themselves were horrific, and they escalated dramatically. The spree began right on New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1980. His first known victim was a 20-year-old college student, Karen Potak. She apparently left a party without her coat. Stephani offered her a ride, and instead he drove her to that secluded parking lot behind his old workplace, the Malmberg Machine Shop.
The place he was fired from.
The very place. And she was beaten savagely with a tire iron, hit more than a dozen times, cracked her skull.
God. Did she?
Miraculously, she survived. But the severity of the attack resulted in significant brain trauma and, critically for the investigation at the time, absolutely no memory of her attacker. She couldn't identify him.
And this is the moment he introduces his persona, the Weepy-Voiced killer.
Yes. Through his first truly bizarre call to police at 3 a.m., he was hysterical, high-pitched, clearly whimpering. He said something like, "Please send a squad to Pierce Butler Road and Malberg Manufacturing Company machine shop. There's a girl hurt there."
So a confession wrapped in a demand for help.
Exactly. A pattern that would absolutely define him.
And then 6 months later, the violence just ramps up. June 3, 1981, he attacks Kimberly Compton, an 18-year-old. And tragically, she had literally just moved to the area from Wisconsin that very day.
That's right. Stephani apparently approached her at a diner, started chatting with her, and she happened to be wearing a red jacket, which might be significant later, and he offered her a tour of the city.
And she was found murdered.
Brutally. Stabbed 61 times with an ice pick. The attack was frenzied, not just the stabbing in the chest, stomach, thighs, but he also strangled her with her own shoelace.
Oh my God. And another call.
Yes, another chilling call came in. This time, "God damn, when do you find me? I just stabbed somebody with an ice pick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody."
I can't stop myself. So the plea is shifting now.
Notice that. It shifts from requesting help for the victim to confessing the compulsion, almost asking them to stop him.
Okay, then the pattern changes slightly. July 1982, Kathleen Greening, 33 years old, strangled and drowned in her bathtub.
Right. And this victim stood apart initially because Stephani did not call the police afterward. So investigators didn't immediately link her death to the Weepy-Voiced killer. It wasn't until later, after he was caught, that he confessed to this one. He said he drove directly to his church to pray and weep right after the crime. Maybe that satisfied the need for confession privately that time. It's hard to say.
But he didn't stay quiet for long.
No, he quickly returned to his theatrical MO. August 5, 1982, he met 40-year-old Barbara Simons at the Hexagon Bar. And she was also dressed in red.
Another victim in red.
Yes. After leaving the bar with him, she was stabbed over 100 times. Stephani called police again, and this time the performance was really at its peak and chillingly specific. He used that signature high-pitched whimpering voice, apologized, confessed, but he also provided these key hidden details that only the killer would know. He actually commanded the dispatcher.
Commanded them.
Yeah. He said, "Please don't talk. Listen, I'm sorry I killed that girl. I stabbed her 40 times. Then he adds, "Kimberly Compton was the first one over in St. Paul."
Wow. So he's not just apologizing, he's actively controlling the call and boasting,
Yeah.
linking his crimes.
Exactly. Controlling the dispatcher, increasing the psychological terror by referencing his previous victim. The sheer audacity of these communiques is really what cemented his place in true crime lore. Stephani didn't just report the crime, which would be bizarre enough for a guilty person. He used this intense emotional distortion, the tearful voice, the apologies, saying things like, "I couldn't help it and I'm sorry I killed that girl." It's theater, really, of the highest, sickest order.
And that takes us right to the core psychological question you have to ask about these 911 calls. Was this intense, tearful performance a sign of, genuine remorse from some deeply conflicted person, maybe a sociopath who feels some fleeting guilt? Or was it just cold, calculated performance art designed purely to serve his own needs?
Well, criminologists, they strongly lean toward the latter, the performance. The calls were likely a mechanism to first control the narrative. Second, increase his bizarre infamy. And maybe most critically, avoid the heavy internalization of guilt.
How does confessing avoid guilt? That seems counterintuitive.
Well, by confessing the act to the authorities, it's almost like he was externalizing the responsibility. It becomes the police's problem to stop him, not his. He repeatedly expressed this overwhelming fear of prison, said he'd rather kill himself than be locked up. That suggests the performance was primarily about self-preservation and maybe psychological relief, not genuine empathy for his victims.
So the confession as a protection mechanism. If he publicly admits it, he shifts the burden. If they fail to stop him, the next killing isn't entirely on his shoulders. That's a truly twisted way of thinking.
Precisely. And, bizarre as they were, the calls did have some investigative impact. Media broadcasts of the voice generated over 150 public tips. Though the emotional distortion, the high pitch, it made a positive, reliable voice ID impossible initially. The most significant value was probably expediting the linkage, connecting these scattered attacks across different jurisdictions, like linking Potak's beating to Compton's stabbing earlier on.
But his reign didn't end because of voice analysis, did it? It ended because one victim fought back.
Hard. That's the crucial turning point. August 20, 1982. He approached 19-year-old sex worker Denise Williams. She was also wearing red. He drove her to a secluded lot, started stabbing her with a Phillips screwdriver 15 times.
Phillips screwdriver.
Yeah, incredibly. But Denise Williams fought back with furious intensity. She actually managed to smash a glass bottle over Stephani's head, causing severe cuts to his cheek, head, and hand. A neighbor, Douglas Panning, heard her screams and intervened, forcing the injured Stephani to flee.
And here's the unbelievable twist that brought him down, right? He was so badly hurt.
He had to call emergency services for himself. He called 911 to report he had got beat up.
No way.
Yes. And when officers arrived at the hospital, they recognized that distinct, high-pitched emotional voice, the voice of the Weepy-Voiced killer, now calling for aid for his own injuries.
The irony is staggering.
Isn't it? And during a follow-up interview with police, when they confronted him with images of the victims, Stephani's voice changed dramatically again, became strained, hysterical. The police knew they had their man. Confirmed by Denise Williams' testimony, and of course the distinct vocal pattern captured on all those 911 tapes, the one time he called the police without a script, focused only on his own survival, the truth was immediately exposed.
Okay, so Stephani was eventually convicted, but the challenge remains, and it's a huge one. How do investigators objectively determine if a highly emotional, confusing 911 call one filled with tears, maybe seemingly genuine sorrow, is actually a manipulative performance designed to confuse the police?
That is the pivotal question. And it moves us from this specific, horrifying true crime history into the realm of formal forensic science. We're transitioning from the Weepy-Voiced killer to the universal challenge of the homicidal 911 call. And this is where we really need to look at Lieutenant Tracy Harpster's landmark 2006 master's thesis, titled The Nature of 911 Homicide Calls. This study is absolutely foundational to modern verbal deception detection in these scenarios.
Harpster's work.
Oh, yeah.
It's so critical because it recognizes that initial 911 statement as this unique piece of forensic evidence, the purest statement made to law enforcement. Tell us a bit more about why it's considered pure.
Well, it's considered pure because the caller's immediate response to that very open-ended prompt, 911, what is your emergency, is essentially unfiltered. It's captured before the environment changes, before the caller has time to fully process or construct a complex lie, and crucially, before the psychological demeanor or this specific questioning style of an interviewing officer can potentially contaminate the statement. It's a moment of either raw truth or raw performance, captured digitally, right at the outset.
And Harpster actually analyzed, 100 closed homicide cases, 50 callers proven innocent, 50 proven guilty.
That's right. And pitted their initial communications against 20 predefined verbal indicators. The goal was to see if specific linguistic tells could reliably predict guilt or innocence, basically transforming a highly stressful subjective experience into measurable objective data.
And this wasn't just based on gut feeling, right? It was rooted in actual linguistic theories.
Absolutely not gut feeling. It's grounded in established linguistic principles. The first is statement analysis, championed by analysts like Dr. Susan Adams and Mark McClish. This theory basically posits that every single word choice, whether conscious or unconscious, deserves scrutiny. The idea is, if someone is fabricating a story, they make fundamentally different linguistic choices than if they are genuinely relaying a memory.
So looking past the story itself, focusing on the grammar, tense, pronouns, things like that.
Exactly. For instance, a guilty person might unconsciously use passive voice more often, the gun went off versus I shot him, or use impersonal pronouns to distance themselves from the event, even if they aren't fully aware they're doing it. It's like McClish asserted, people's words will betray them.
Okay, makes sense. What other theories?
The second theoretical pillar is the Undeutsch hypothesis. This suggests that statements based on actual lived experiences will differ fundamentally in structure and content from fabricated statements. Truthful accounts tend to have more context, more sensory details, spontaneous corrections, maybe complexities, whereas fictitious accounts are often shorter, more repetitive, and rigidly adhere to a simplified narrative structure because the person is worried about maintaining consistency, about getting caught in a lie.
And the third one you mentioned earlier, the smokescreen idea.
Right. That's the concept of extraneous information, developed largely by researchers like Rudisill and McClish. And this is a really powerful tell for deception. The theory here is that deceptive individuals often overcommunicate. They supply massive amounts of information that is completely irrelevant or unnecessary to the immediate emergency.
Why would they do that? Seems counterproductive if you're trying to hide something.
Well, they're essentially creating a linguistic smokescreen, a rambling dissertation, as some call it, to hide the small piece of truth they're desperately trying to avoid mentioning. They sort of assume if they provide this overwhelming detail about peripheral topics, the critical gaps or inconsistencies in their core narrative will just get overlooked. It's a crucial concept, and we'll see just how devastatingly accurate it can be in predicting guilt.
Okay, so let's dive into the indicators themselves. Let's start by defining what an honest caller sounds like, based on Harpster's research. Focusing first on what the study calls the immediacy measure. The idea being when someone is genuinely confronted with a life or death crisis, especially involving a loved one, urgency and unfiltered distress should be the immediate expected reaction.
Exactly. And the first indicator they look for is pretty basic. The simple plea for help. In a real crisis, this should be almost automatic, right? Help me, send an ambulance. Yet the data was actually alarming. It was absent in 43% of the cases studied, almost half. For the innocent caller, the plea is usually a singular focus. For the guilty caller, the focus is often on just reporting a fact, there's a body here, rather than urgently requesting an action. Get help here now.
Can you give an example of what that absence looks like?
Sure, there was a father in the study who had shaken his infant to death. He called 911, but instead of pleading for help, he simply reported the medical status of the child in almost clinical terms. There was no hurry or please help my baby. If that immediate visceral plea for assistance is missing, the dispatcher's suspicion should definitely rise.
But the timing matters too, doesn't it? Not just if they plead, but when.
Incredibly important. That brings us to the location of the plea. Innocence strongly correlates with the plea being right there in the first communication. That immediate, almost explosive response to 911, what is your emergency?
So guilty callers might delay it.
Often, yes. They might wait minutes into the conversation before actually asking for help. Their primary agenda might be to establish their alibi first, or report the situation passively. I just found them like this. They aren't focused on seeking immediate, urgent assistance for the victim. The timing of the plea really exposes the caller's true priority.
Now, let's talk about the most powerful indicator you mentioned, the one that must have really stood out, the urgent demanding plea.
Yes. This is a variable where the statistics are just absolute. It was present in about 16% of the pleas studied, and 100% every single one of the 911 callers who demonstrated this variable were found to be innocent of the homicide.
100%.
100% innocent. 0% guilty. This is arguably the single most reliable linguistic marker for veracity found in the study.
Wow. Why is that kind of urgency so impossible to fake convincingly? Can't a killer just scream, hurry up?
It's about the psychological depth, I think. This plea isn't just a generic scream for help. It's an authoritative, immediate, non-negotiable demand for action. It often overrides the dispatcher's attempts to gather standard information. Think of the difference between, say, he's laying in the alley, I think I need help, versus something like, you need to get paramedics to 845 South Euclid. Now, just get here. That level of singular, desperate focus on the victim's immediate need for rescue is extraordinarily difficult for a person who just caused that distress to generate convincingly. Their mind is too occupied with managing their deception, not maximizing the speed of the medical response.
That makes perfect sense. The killer's urgency is about protecting themselves, not saving the victim.
Precisely. Another immediacy indicator they look for is verbal reaction before dispatcher introduction. When the 911 system connects, there's that tiny fraction of a second before the dispatcher actually speaks their intro line. An innocent caller operating under peak visceral stress is often already reacting in that tiny window, crying out, pleading, demanding assistance before the dispatcher even cues the line. It's like the mask is completely off in that split second.
That sounds like a really subtle, almost microscopic tell.
It is rare, yeah. Present in only about 10% of the calls studied. But significantly, 80% of those callers who showed it were innocent. The fact that the caller is already verbalizing their panic indicates they are completely overwhelmed by the event itself, not rehearsing an introduction or trying to control the narrative from the start. It's an inverse relationship with guilt. The less premeditated the start of the call seems, the more likely the caller is truthful.
Okay, let's shift to the accuracy measure. This relates to how truthful individuals handle new information as it comes in, right? In real time.
Exactly. And the single most reliable, though again, quite rare indicator of truthfulness here is self-correction.
Self-correction, so admitting a mistake.
Essentially, yes. It's defined as when the caller spontaneously corrects their own original information upon realizing new external details during the call. For example, they might initially report the victim was lying flat on the floor, but then look again and say, wait, no, she's actually slumped against the wall. I was mistaken.
So they're adapting their story to fit the reality they're seeing.
Exactly. They're adjusting their language to fit reality as it unfolds. This occurred in only 6% of the calls in Harpster's study. But again, the correlation was absolute. 100% of those callers were innocent. Not a single guilty caller self-corrected during the discourse.
Wow. So truthful people adjust to reality, while deceptive people stick rigidly to their fabricated story.
That's the finding. They seem to fear that any deviation, even to correct a small detail, will expose the entire lie. So they cling to the original fabrication, even if it starts to conflict with observable facts.
Okay, incredibly useful for spotting innocence. Now, let's flip the script. Let's look at the patterns that actively betray the killer, the indicators of guilt. You said the strongest predictor was the extraneous measure, providing unnecessary info.
Yes, by far. This is that linguistic smokescreen concept in action. Extraneous information is defined as any unexpected communication that falls completely outside the context of the emergency. Details that do absolutely nothing to help the police or medical services respond effectively. This was the single most powerful indicator of guilt discovered in the study. It had a massive Pearson's correlation coefficient of 0.806, which in statistical terms means it's an incredibly strong, highly reliable relationship.
And what does that strong correlation translate to in terms of the results? How many guilty callers showed this?
It means 95% of the callers who exhibited this variable providing extraneous, irrelevant information were later proven guilty. 95%.
Why they do it? Why pad the story?
The thinking is that the truth is sparse, maybe too simple, and they fear the dispatcher will notice the lack of detail. So they need to fill the void, create noise, confusion.
I remember the example you mentioned from the source material. A mother reporting her 6-month-old wasn't breathing, but then throwing in totally random details.
Exactly. She said things like, he's like ate an apple and he's burping it up. He's not it's like a seizure attack. We got in a car. That detail about getting in a car is completely irrelevant to the immediate medical emergency of a choking or seizing infant. It's padding. An innocent person, totally focused on the crisis, would typically strip their language down to the absolute necessary core: location, victim status, and that urgent plea for help. A guilty person, maybe focused on establishing an alibi or deflecting blame, throws in these irrelevant, confusing details to create chaos and distract the listener.
That makes the Weepy-Voiced killer's constant apologies and self-focused emotional distress fit perfectly into this merger, doesn't it? I couldn't help it. I'm sorry I killed her.
Absolutely. Textbook examples. They were extraneous details masking the truth of his culpability.
Yeah.
They were noise serving his psychological needs, not the victim's needs.
Okay. Next up is the distancing measure. Indicators that show a lack of appropriate emotional investment where you'd absolutely expect distress. And the first one sounds bizarre. Inappropriate politeness.
It sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it's about unexpected, overly gracious language where immediate urgency should prevail.
What does that sound like in a real tragedy? Are they like asking the dispatcher how their day is going while reporting a murder?
Almost. Imagine calling 911 to report that you and your spouse have both been shot, and starting the call with a calm, polite, "Hi, I've been shot and my husband has been shot." That civility, that almost detached graciousness, it replaces the panic and chaos you'd naturally expect in a life-threatening event. And the finding, 100% of callers who use this kind of inappropriate politeness were guilty. The civility seems to serve as an emotional buffer, a way to distance themselves from the horror.
That's genuinely chilling. It's like they pick up the phone and treat the crisis like some mundane chore they're just reporting efficiently.
It absolutely feels like that. And this connects directly to the next indicator: acceptance of death with relationship. Think about it. When a loved one dies suddenly, unexpectedly right in front of you, the universal expected reaction from an innocent person who is present is almost always denial. Or at least the immediate, desperate request for every life-saving measure attempted. Try CPR, do something.
At the guilty caller, they just accept it instantly.
Yes. If the caller was present at the scene and had a relationship with the victim, spouse, parent, child, etc., instantly accepting the mortality of that victim is a massive red flag.
Yeah.
Why? Because they likely already know the outcome is irreversible, because they caused it. The study found again 100% of callers who exhibited this variable immediate acceptance of death while having a close relationship with the victim were guilty.
So instead of pleading for resuscitation, they're basically just reporting a fact. Like the example, I just got home from work and my wife is laying dead at the bottom of the stairs. There's no struggle to process the fatality. They're simply documenting a known outcome.
It's the stark difference between asking for help to save a life and asking for the police to come process a corpse. Very telling. We also find possession of a problem fitting into this distancing measure. This is when the caller uses the first-person pronoun I to indicate personal ownership of the problem. I have a situation here. but then fails to follow through by asking for immediate, specific assistance for the victim.
Like the example, I have an unconscious child who is breathing very shallowly. They state, I have, owning the problem, but where's the demand for a solution? Where's the send an ambulance now?
Exactly. And again, the correlation was absolute. 100% of the callers who used this I possession structure were found to be guilty. They are framing the event as their burden or their crisis, rather than focusing on the victim's immediate need for outside intervention. It's another form of subtle emotional distancing, replacing that altruistic urgency with self-focused reporting.
And then perhaps the most morally disturbing distancing mechanism, the one that really seems to reveal the malice, is insulting or blaming the victim.
Yeah, this one is extremely rare, thankfully. And it's virtually unimaginable for an innocent person facing a tragedy involving someone they care about. The pain and grief should normally silence any possible critique or blame. Yet, in the study, there was a father calling about his dying daughter who actually described her as very, very sneaky, and even suggested she might have taken something because she'd thrown a huge temper tantrum earlier.
Wow, as she's dying, he's actively trying to taint her reputation, to blame her.
Unbelievable, right? And yes, 100% of the callers who did this were guilty. It's a profound, active, moral distancing. It almost feels like they're establishing the groundwork for a future defense argument, or maybe trying to justify their own actions by implying the victim was somehow deserving or responsible for their own fate. Truly disturbing.
Okay, finally, let's look at the evasion measure. These are the verbal tactics guilty callers use to basically stall, dodge, or hide the truth. And you mentioned the third strongest correlation in the entire study was resistance to answer.
That's right. It's defined as unexpected resistance to a logical, relevant question from the dispatcher. You have to remember, the caller's stated goal, ostensibly, is to get immediate assistance. Resisting a direct, relevant question goes completely against that stated goal. So if the dispatcher asks a reasonable question like, did something happen before this? Was there an argument? And the caller responds defensively with something like, that's all I'm trying to report right now. That's resistance. And the finding, 100% of individuals exhibiting this kind of resistance to answering were guilty.
Because if you're innocent and desperate for help, you'd provide every single piece of information requested without hesitation, wouldn't you? You'd want them to have everything.
Exactly, you'd cooperate fully. The killer, however, is desperately trying to maintain control over the limited, carefully constructed narrative they've prepared. The dispatcher's question is perceived as a direct threat to that fragile lie.
And there were two other major evasion indicators that also showed a 100% guilt correlation.
Yes, conflicting facts and the infamous factor.
Okay, let's distinguish conflicting facts from self-correction again. They sound similar, but one signals truth and the other signals deception.
Right. The key difference is adaptation versus collapse. Self-correction, remember, is the innocent caller adapting their story to fit new external reality they observe. Conflicting facts, on the other hand, occur when the guilty caller provides information that directly contradicts a previous statement they made within their own narrative. For example, claiming the baby had been fine for the last few hours, but then immediately saying the phone ringing just woke them up. Those two things can't both be true. The narrative is collapsing under its own weight because the lie is too complex to maintain consistency under pressure. And yes, 100% of callers with these internal conflicting facts were guilty.
And the factor, this must be the most telling sign of just pure fabrication, right? When they seem lost in their own story.
It really is. It's that moment when the caller shows genuine confusion when asked a logical, straightforward question about their own reported story. It reveals they weren't actually tracking their fictitious narrative because the details were never real. They were just invented on the fly. So if a caller claims their wife fell down the stairs, but when the dispatcher asks a simple follow-up like, okay, about how many stairs did she fall down? And the caller responds with a blank, or, I don't know. It strongly suggests the story was only superficially sketched out in their mind. It wasn't a lived experience. And the study found 91% of callers exhibiting this factor were guilty.
The power of Harpster study, looking at all these indicators together, it's just undeniable. It really provides an objective checklist, doesn't it? It transforms that high-stress, subjective mystery of the 911 call into something potentially actionable, measurable forensic evidence. The difference between genuine urgency and calculated deception, it seems, is measurable in these distinct patterns. Immediate demanding pleas and self-correction point towards truth, while all those extraneous details, the weird civility, the refusal to track the narrative, they strongly signal guilt.
Absolutely. And this brings us right back full circle to the Weepy-Voiced killer Paul Michael Stephani. If we apply these modern metrics to his calls, the very calls that inspired that new TV plotline, his performance flags him immediately and comprehensively across multiple guilt measures.
Okay, let's break that down. How would his calls stack up against these indicators?
Well, first, his repeated, intense, tearful apologies. I couldn't help it. I'm sorry I killed that girl. That's textbook extraneous information. Those statements served his need for psychological relief and maybe narrative control. They did nothing for the immediate medical needs of the victim. His focus was entirely on his suffering, his compulsion, not the victim's survival.
And what about that chilling command he gave the dispatcher? Please don't talk, listen.
That could easily be classified as resistance to answer, or at least an attempt to completely control the discourse, which is highly suspicious. He was actively resisting the dispatcher's natural and necessary process of collecting data and intervening. He was trying to force the conversation into this one-sided confession, or maybe even a boast. His actions, even though framed in what sounded like hysterics, were intensely goal-oriented towards self-reporting and achieving that psychological distancing we talked about. The pure statement, despite Stephani's best attempts to manipulate it through this elaborate emotional performance, remained an open window into the truth, flagged by these modern linguistic markers.
It really suggests that even the most emotionally compelling attempt at calculated remorse, like the Weepy-Voiced killer's performance, leaves behind these quantifiable linguistic and behavioral tells, clues that investigators can now potentially use to peel back the layers of deception. The voice might shake, the tears might flow, but the language chosen, the structure of the call itself, that seems to be the real evidence.
And, that raises a really intense final question for you, the listener, to consider. If this forensic science of analyzing emergency calls continues to evolve, continues to get refined, could these linguistic cues ever become so reliable, so statistically powerful, that for a guilty caller, the very words they choose in that initial call could become, in effect, an arrestable offense? Evidence strong enough to act on even before the body is located or other physical evidence is gathered. The truth, it seems, might really be found in the words they couldn't help but say.
Okay, so we hope you liked our today's discussion. For more such discussions, subscribe to our channel, Phantom Homicide.